It's rare that a video game adaptation of a movie ends up being good or even in any way decent. Most of the time they end up being bad, and the same applies for movies that are based on video games. Both mediums are fundamentally different, but it's especially hard to turn a movie into a video game, no matter how perfect that movie might be for a video game adaptation. I am a huge fan of the Guardians movies, but when the game released, I wasn't as hyped as everyone else. I was afraid of giving into the hype because most of the time, games that are overhyped never manage to actually come close or fulfill the hype. Only a few games managed to do so in recent history, such as GTA 5 or Red Dead Redemption. Nevertheless, when Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy came out, I was honestly surprised at all the positive feedback it was getting and decided that I had to play it for myself and write down and record my thoughts. Guardians of the Galaxy is without a doubt visually one of the most creative and beautiful games I've ever played. It clearly takes a lot of inspirations from a lot of different sci-fi sources such as Dune or Star Wars, but it's also full of retro sci-fi art styles that are drenched deep into its art direction. While most of the game is clearly a very 80s nostalgia focused game, a lot of its areas do give off strong 70s sci-fi vibes. I think the developers did this deliberately to give this game a sense of retro nostalgia not seen in most other games. When you walk around Nowhere, for example, you'll notice how the whole city is drenched in neon lights and feels like it's out of an 80s movie. There are so many details here, it's insane. Neon colors, mulets, jeans and leather jackets. Imagine a more colorful Blade Runner mixed with cyberpunk and Terminator-esque influences. One planet, for example, looks exactly like sci-fi art from the 70s. You can see other planets from the distance. It's got a deep orange and gold color composition going on, mixed with a red, almost glowing sky and purplish plants. This is not a coincidence. The developers chose this look for a reason. You cannot play this game without noticing countless homages to movies from past eras. Every step you make and every breath you take brings you back to the 80s or 70s, but especially the 80s. The entire game has a love affair going on with the 80s and seems to scream retro nostalgia everywhere you go. Nostalgia culture has always existed and will continue to exist and change, but it seems like the last few years or even the last decade has had a strong connection to the 90s and 80s. I don't know why these two eras specifically, as other eras have a lot of great elements too, but this nostalgia trend is getting stronger and stronger and pop culture reflects this the most. I mean, have you noticed how many modern movie posters and even musical album covers have strong neon colors going on? A lot of blues, reds, purples and pinks, even if the movies or albums are not in a retro genre. Take for example the John Wick 3 movie posters. It's a modern movie taking place in the modern world, yet two of the movie's posters remind me of Blade Runner and Beverly Hills Cop 2, in terms of their color palette and overall vibe. Adding to that, the soundtrack to John Wick 3 is heavy on synthwave and outrun. If you don't know what synthwave, vaporwave or outrun is, let me explain. They are a multitude of different things combined. Sounds a bit confusing, I know. But, for example, synthwave is a music genre that is strongly inspired and based on new wave and synthpop from the 80s and early 90s. But it's also a visual art style. As you can see, these pictures are all considered synthwave because they have strong glowing neon colors, and some also have references to movies such as Back to the Future, Top Gun, Risky Business, and many more. Guardians of the Galaxy has tons of such influences and is clearly a product of the nostalgia movement and trend that is popular right now. There are a lot of scenes where you will see classic jeans jackets with rock bands pins, Playmate posters, mulets and puffed up hair, and of course, lots of hair metal bands. In fact, part of the soundtrack consists of a fictional metal band called Starlord. This band is what inspired Quill to call himself Starlord, since he used to be a big fan. This band has recorded a whole album for the game, and their music will play periodically as you continue playing. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is nostalgia done right. It has tons of visual references, but it never gets old or overused. They know exactly when to shove the 80s in your face and when not to do so. This game actually reminds me strongly of GTA Vice City. Yes, in terms of plot and gameplay, they couldn't be further apart, but they are both products of 80s nostalgia. Vice City constantly references movies, TV shows, and pop culture from the 80s, and its entire soundtrack is the reason why a whole generation of teenagers growing up with Vice City experienced a phenomenon called fake nostalgia. Vice City soundtrack is as perfect as it's legendary, and I'd even say that it defines 50% of the overall experience playing the game. And the exact same thing counts for Guardians of the Galaxy. These two games are brothers in an interesting way, and I am convinced that Guardians of the Galaxy will not only be remembered because of its amazing visuals and story, but also because of its fantastic soundtrack. One of the most amazing things about Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy are the facial animations. The amount of hard work that must have gone into them is just crazy. They look very realistic, at least as realistic as a video game that does not use expensive equipment like LA Noire can get. I would even go so far and say that they are almost on par with LA Noire, which is quite the achievement as LA Noire was using real facial expressions while the ones in this game are animated. Back when LA Noire came out, it was revolutionary in many of its aspects, and honestly, a lot of it still holds up when it comes to attention to detail, acting, faces, and the maturity of its story. Unfortunately, the technology to produce those facial animations in Noir was extremely expensive and difficult, and no other game since then used it, relying instead on motion capture, which was new at the time and rising quickly in popularity. So seeing the level of detail on facial animations in Guardians of the Galaxy just shows you how far the industry has come and how amazing something like this can look in the right hands. Guardians manages to present amazing facial animations that make each cutscene look very cinematic and realistic. You can see emotions and small details in the eyes of a person. The acting of the voice and motion capture actors puts another icing on the cake, as they do a fantastic job in making the characters stand out and stay true to the source material. Especially Drax, Rocket and Groot sound exactly like their movie counterparts. Character development is done very well and never feels unearned or out of place. This is partially because there is a lot of dialogue both in cutscenes and during regular gameplay. In fact, characters are almost always talking, making fun of something or pointing something out. They talk and behave like real people would in the situations they find themselves in. They even comment on your inability to perform a certain task or if you've done something wrong. With so much dialogue, and you also being able to choose your answers and replies, you get to grow close to these characters and learn a lot of personal details. This game has more dialogue than any game I've ever played, but it never feels too much, annoying or out of place. Just like no plot points feel undeserved. Despite being mostly comedic and not taking itself too seriously, this game has very well made sad, serious and dark moments. Being a writer and a creative person myself, it's very hard to maintain a balance of different elements, especially when trying to write a story that spans 30 hours. The writers of this game did a phenomenal job in my opinion. The gameplay is fantastic and at the same time a bit clunky. You will never play any of the other Guardians, only Star-Lord. However, being the leader of the Guardians, you can give orders to the others or ask them for favors. You have this option both during fights and regular gameplay, depending on the situation. Each Guardian has his own set of special abilities that can be very useful and life-saving. The combat is very fast-paced and will require your whole attention, not only on the enemies, but also your Guardians, as they might get overwhelmed and you will have to come and save them. This doesn't happen too often. The Guardians are usually strong enough to deal with most situations. But it also means that you will have to do a lot of micromanaging during combat. Honestly, the gameplay is sometimes so fast-paced and amazing, my adrenaline was spiking every time there was a fight happening. Some fights can be challenging, but when you're kicking ass as Star-Lord, and especially with your team together, it's one hell of an experience that will leave you thirsting for more. Combat is fun and very rewarding, but sometimes there's so much going on the screen that, especially for a new player, it can feel overwhelming. Not only do you have to fight off enemies, you also have to order around your team, telling them what special abilities to use and on which enemy. And of course, Star-Lord has his own set of abilities that you can also choose from. There are a lot of abilities that all differ from each other and have various effects, giving you the option to strategically use them, depending on the enemy you are fighting. But your screen will always be clustered with all kinds of messages, health bars, options, etc. Sure, you could turn all of that off in the hot menu, but I wouldn't recommend it. Sometimes it feels like the game is training you to become a multitasking black belt master. In my opinion, one of the coolest features are Star-Lord's flying boots that let you hover above ground for a short period of time, and his dual blasters, which never run out of ammo but overheat if used without pause and need time to cool down. The flying boots are addictive and so much fun you'll find yourself using them all the time even when you don't need them. One of the best gameplay features is the option to huddle up. When you huddle up during a fight, you're basically giving your team a motivational speech, and depending on what you choose to say, the entire team will get buffed while fighting or only you. And of course, a random song from the 80s will start playing while you're fighting. Let me tell you, kicking ass while Motley Crue plays in the background is simply amazing.
Pew, 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 pew.